surveillance video of a parkade posted on social media shows an exchange between an Edmonton police officer and an 18-year-old man. The video then shows the officer taking him to the ground and repeatedly punching him.
4 officers demanding a man get on the ground. He continues to approach the officers. He looks to have been tasered and falls to the ground. A few seconds later, what sounds like 6 shots are fired. CPR is applied, but the man dies. Edmonton police say a knife was recovered at the scene.
Hi.
I want to talk about the goal of the policing committee, the goal of the CTLA. The goal in relation to advocating for policing reform is so that we have the best possible policing for all Albertans. No good cops want to work with bad cops. The problem is that the bad cops stay, the good cops leave. The failure of police services to weed out the bad cops destroys internal morale in police services. And of course, it destroys the reputation of the police service in the community.
We need independent and civilian-based mechanisms for police accountability. No matter what your race, your religion, your class, your neighborhood, we all want and deserve to feel safe in our community. Community should be a space where we can all belong, thrive, and achieve our full potential. We want to know that no one is above the law and that we can trust the systems of accountability and oversight that exist to protect us. For too long and for too many, this has just not been the case. And police legitimacy is only possible when community has the trust of the police. The police build trust by being procedurally just, that is, by treating the public fairly and with respect. When the police do not appear to be taking public concerns seriously, especially involving allegations of serious brutality or lethal force, it damages the faith and trust in our police force. And when people don't trust the police, they won't call the police, they won't obey the police, and they won't cooperate with the police. And other officers are undermined when the tone set at the top does not treat serious concerns with the utmost of seriousness. So this harms the ability of police to keep everybody safe. And our hope is that by attending this tour, you'll be able to honor those who have been and continue to be harmed and have greater agency in our own lives and our own works to hold police accountable. It's not to be said that the great majority of police officers and police interactions are legitimate and justifiable. Police misconduct is a stain that impacts officers who join the ranks for the right reasons and are committed to doing the good work. They too are victims of police misconduct, as they don't feel they have the ability to report their colleagues without sanction or retribution against them or their careers. We want to create a culture where if you can see something, you must and can safely say something. We want to see misconduct treated seriously by police service, the chief, the provincial government, via the Police Act. This has not been the case, and the time is now. Let's share with each other today in respect and reciprocity, expand each of our awareness as well as build on our ideas for a strengthened effort of accountability.
Both humbled and a little bit angry that I'm here today. I spent 25 years in policing. I'm proud of a lot of things I've done, and I'm proud of a lot of people I worked with. That being said, policing needs a massive change. There needs to be massive reform. We're talking about police legitimacy here, but we're also talking about legal cynicism. When the Crown decides not to lay charges after charges are recommended in a case like Pacy Dumas, that puts the whole system under question. We have systemic racism, we have all of these things that occur, and we have a training method in policing that teaches us that everyone that we interact with is a threat. How do you be compassionate with a threat? And then the other thing is our biology tells us that if someone doesn't look like us, they're a double threat. And all of a sudden we become excessive in our violence because we are afraid. We need to change the way policing is trained. We need to change the way we hire in policing. And we need to reform policing from the top and the bottom down and up. And we also need to change the justice system. It's ridiculous that after the inception of the Gladue decision, we've seen a 53% increase in the incarceration of Indigenous people in this country. When you start to look at crime and you start to look at violence and you start to look at what's going on in our world, and we look at all of these things and we start to deal with these with the justice hammer, we're wrong. This isn't a justice issue, this is a health issue. When you start to look at the research that I was fortunate to be part of with the University of Alberta Prison Project, where we look at 97% of women incarcerated in Western Canadian prisons, both federally and provincially, and 95% of men are all victims of trauma. They live lives of violence. And I say, well, it's sad that 83 and 85% of these victimizations occurred at the average age of 9, as these individuals were children. We're talking about average childhood experiences. We're talking about symptomatic criminality. Crime is a symptom of trauma, and we have done this wrong the entire time. We need to start looking at policing with the trauma-informed lens. We need to start looking at policing and justice from a public health perspective, because the social determinants of crime and the social determinants of health are almost identical. And when we deal with this with the justice hammer, we're doing it wrong, and we're continuously harming individuals, and we're creating them and putting them in situations that's going to make them more harmful. We take individuals and we incarcerate them with the idea that they're going to somehow get better without any real assistance inside those federal and provincial correctional facilities. There's nothing there in there that's going to work with somebody, and anyone who's never spent any time in a jail, I can tell you, you can't heal in a cell. You can't heal in a place that doesn't allow you to sleep at night because there's always lights on. And there's a lot of research that shows when you don't have the proper sleep, you're going to continuously suffer. We continuously, in the justice system, we have an adversarial system. We look at it's an us versus them mentality. We need to start going back and looking at this as a community mentality. One of the things that frustrates me most about policing is we tick box everything. We're going to train a tick box. We're going to be culturally competent. One day I get a training, I'm culturally competent. I'm going to train for trauma informed, but one day I'm going to be trauma informed. We make people take first aid every 2 to 3 years. 0.06% of the population in Canada has hepatitis C. 0.006% of the population has HIV. And when I wrote an article on this, 2.17% of our population had COVID-19, and we were all wearing masks. I go back to that stat I talked about earlier. 97% of women and 95% of men are experiencing trauma that are incarcerated in our jails. It's time that we take that seriously and we become trauma-informed and really take it to heart, and we become compassionate. And compassionate needs to be a competency in policing and justice.
Hi all, my name is Chad Haggerty. I'm Métis. I'm from the East Prairie Métis settlement in northern Alberta. I'm currently a defense lawyer in Calgary. Prior to going to law school and graduating in 2019, I was an RCMP officer in northern Alberta for 17 years. For 14 of those years, I worked in Indigenous communities. When I would get to the communities, it felt like home in many ways. The people were the same. My grandmother had been in residential schools. My parents had been in residential day schools. I understood the trauma that was happening. When we talk about the issues in policing, one of the things that we talk about is the need to hire different people. Well, I would suggest that I was a great hire. I understood the Indigenous communities I was living in. Here's what's never factored in. The fact that when anybody comes into police culture, they're tainted by the culture in the police organization. Never mind the fact that I understood the people that I was working with, that I could understand a little bit of Cree, that I could, their lived experience resonated with me. That didn't matter because the uniform beside me was telling me that you need to fit in with me. Never mind the community. That extended throughout police culture. A previous speaker spoke about cultural competency. There were cultural competency courses in the RCMP when I was with them. Indigenous cultural competency would be the way that it was written on the paper. How it was talked about was who's taking the Hug an Indian course this week, because it sunk no deeper than the surface. It didn't permeate and it didn't create cultural change. That's one of the biggest problems that we have to overcome when it comes to policing. Again, a prior speaker talked about the need to change from the top down and the bottom up. Well, that sounds like all of it. You cannot change bits and pieces of a horribly broken system. And when the horribly broken system is intent on continuing itself, we can talk, we can ride buses, we can make documentaries, but until the powers that be, until the governments, until the city councils, until the people rise up and force governments to foster the change, to enact the change, nothing will. Policing has been a corrupt, broken institution for a long time. And even as I say that, I have to recognize that individual police officers, like me, went in with great ideals, want to help our community. So why is it that you don't hear active police officers talking about the corruption, talking about the broken nature of the job? It's because if you lift your head up to speak out, somebody whacks you in the head. You need to trust the people around you to keep you safe, because you do engage in dangerous situations. And if you speak up, you could be alone in those dangerous situations. The trauma that comes with the job is something that most people can understand. Dan Jones spoke earlier about the trauma of people in custody, and that's absolutely true. Same for police. Will the police organizations address it? They'll tell you they are. They'll check their little box and say we offered psychological services. The system is entirely broken. In Alberta, we're fortunate to have the Alberta Serious Incident Response Team overseeing police, right? It's nice to have oversight. Hold on, wait a second, don't get too excited. Who works in ACERT? Ex-police officers, retired police officers. Guess what? They still have a policing mindset. The executive director of ACERT retired a little while ago, the previous one, Sue Hewson. She left. The government spun that as a planned departure. The reality? She had left. She spoke up. That wasn't a planned departure. She got sick of it and she left. The new ACERT director, Mike Ewanson, former Crown prosecutor out of Calgary. As a defense lawyer, I've dealt with him on files. He's incredibly fair. He's incredibly thoughtful. Is there evidence of that? Yes. He suggested that Ben Todd, the constable that assaulted Pacy, be charged. The Crown Prosecution Service said no. So if we have an oversight committee that's saying police officers who engage in illegal conduct ought to be charged, but a prosecution service that says no, do we have effective oversight? We sure don't. That system is just as broken as the policing system.
It was December 2020, and 18-year-old Pacy Dumas and his brother Blair were crawling out of a house under the direction of officers responding to a report of a fight with a knife. What happened next is something Alberta's police watchdog described as hasty and violent. A witness in ACERT's report said Constable Ben Todd kicked Pacy in the head like a soccer ball. ACERT determined there were reasonable grounds to believe the officer committed a criminal offense. But nearly 3 years later, Todd still hasn't been charged.
In circumstances that can in no way justify what was done, Pacy and his brother Blair were compliant with police who had showed up at their home on this very spot. They followed direction at every step of the way. Blair was immediately handcuffed by the police. We're told that Pacy was not handcuffed when he was lying face down on the ground. There's no identified explanation for why they didn't immediately handcuff Pacy as well. If they did not, and the officers, according to an eyewitness standing very nearby with a bird's eye view watching everything happen, describes a scenario where one of the officers, Ben Todd, was vibrating with anger, screaming at Pacy on the ground, asking him about a knife. According to the witness, Pacy was compliant, face down, and then all of a sudden the officer just runs at him and kicks him full force in the head. We do know the results of that. Immediately went unconscious and in serious life-threatening distress, was transported to hospital and had a section of his skull removed to save his life so that his brain could swell and heal. Part of the travesty of the situation is that Irene was inside the house with another police officer who she had warmly welcomed into the home without problem. They wanted to check and make sure there was no weapons or threat to the officers in the home, and she let them in. This event unfolded while she was in the home. When she came out to the sound of an ambulance and seeing her son's blood on the ground and neither of her sons anywhere to be seen, the police refused to tell her what had happened. They refused to tell her where he had been transported to, the condition he was in. She was told to calm down or they would arrest her. So she's being threatened to be arrested because, like any mother, she's in agony and distress over her children. It just continues. The insult to injury after ACERT investigates highly qualified Crown prosecutors, seconded police officers, retired officers, some of whom are experts in use of force, conclude at the end of the investigation that criminal charges are warranted. Aggravated assault is what this crime is. That is one of the most serious offenses in the criminal code, one step down from murder and attempted murder. And the Crown Prosecution Service determines confidentially, under Crown privilege, that they're not going to prosecute and they're not going to tell anyone why they're making that decision, other than to continue to refer to empty statements that they never link back to any evidence, that don't make any sense to any lawyer or other person who understands the law. And they get to hide in secrecy, what I would call hiding in secrecy, because they don't have to identify who made the decision. If that wasn't insulting enough, we choose to take advantage of the private prosecution section in the criminal code, and we make the choice to bring this to a courtroom. We need to present the evidence to a judge, and the Crown steps in and again stays the prosecution before we get to the day where it was scheduled for court. The Crown Prosecution Service has all the power to make the decisions about who is prosecuted in this city, in this province, whether citizen, civilian citizen, or police officer. There is no right of review, there is no right of appeal, and that is wrong. Especially in a case like this that is so obvious, so glaringly obvious that a crime has occurred. ACERT has recommended charges that this should be put before a court. The police officers, all of whom were involved, should be given equal opportunity to present their evidence. And if they can justify the actions, give them that opportunity to do so. The public is entitled to transparency and accountability in the police service that have a tremendous amount of power over the citizens. We're going to do our best to make sure that there is change. What would you like to say?
I don't really have nothing to say right now. It's overwhelming. Getting shot down and then trying, but we're not giving up. We have to do it. And Pacy did want to come out, but his anxiety is so bad right now. And
he was very upset.
Supporting us.
He was very upset this morning.
Yeah.
At 6 this morning when he called and said this is a lot. This happened to him when he was 18. He's 20, just 21 now.
Yeah, 21.
For anyone who has kids, you're still a kid at 18, 19, 20, despite being of legal age. And he said this morning, this is a lot. I've been through a lot.
Plus mourning, grieving for his brother. We're having a hard time with that too. His brother Blair. Yeah, lost of Blair, because he was with working on a case with us, but then he passed away in March last year. And that's hard on him too. And then dealing with this, it's all hard on us every day. We're struggling. He's struggling. His siblings struggle. But
Blair really struggled with the fact that he wasn't there, that he couldn't defend his younger brother from what happened. He witnessed it. He watched it. He told us that when he was handcuffed and walking past Pacy laying on the ground when the kick happened, and he started to have a panic attack at seeing his brother lose consciousness and not knowing if he was dead or alive in that moment. And he had asked the officer to open the police car door, and he couldn't breathe. He was told to shut the F up. There was zero appreciation or respect for the seriousness of this situation. One of the most important things is the very clear message to police officers that a badge and a uniform puts you above the law. There will be no repercussions for any actions taken against citizens, lawful or unlawful. It gives a green light to those so inclined to engage in bad behavior to continue to do so. Majority of police officers respect the authority they're given. They honor their uniform and the badge, and they do the best job they can. It is a few bad apples, so to speak, and the only people that can ensure that they don't have the power and authority is, number one, the chief of police, ACERT, who has been trying to do their job when they recommend charges, and the Crown Prosecution Service, the Minister of Justice, the Police Commission, all have to come together and say that those kinds of officers will no longer be tolerated in the police service, and they need to be removed from the street immediately, especially in a case as serious as this, where the evidence right from the get-go was apparent that Ben Todd was a threat to the community and should not have been allowed to continue policing after that. He did for some time.
And in this scenario, I feel like adding, like, when law enforcement officers get away with that kind of behavior, it makes it okay for other law enforcement officers. It stretches that boundary in terms of what's acceptable behavior for law enforcement. So even if you may not be a bad apple, things can shift and change over time, because the trauma even that law enforcement officers experience moves them into spaces that aren't healthy. And so those are things that it also impacts that way as well.
Brings down police morale, and then we hear that there are police services having trouble hiring good people, because if you had aspired in your lifetime to be a police officer, to work in the policing community, but you see what is going on and you hear that putting yourself in that kind of employment situation is going to call upon you to question your own morality, it's demoralizing to the good officers who have to stand by and watch other officers abuse their authority without consequence.
The flag in question is meant to show the Edmonton Police Association's support for police officers, but for many it has a much more hurtful meaning and is a symbol of police versus the public. The flag is similar to the Canadian flag, but it's black and white with a thin blue line running across it. Multiple police forces have banned the thin blue line flag in the U.S., and in Canada it's not allowed to be used by the RCMP.
This merely exacerbates existing social divisions, and I don't think that is what they intend to do. And therefore, I would warmly encourage them to rethink that strategy. What does this help you achieve? How does this, when distilled to its most elemental part, help any officer on the front lines? How does it really provide support? Every occupation struggles with personnel issues, and policing is no exception. Years of carefully crafted policies, rigorous community engagement, and well-manicured training may be undone by excessive use of force incidents. Personnel issues in policing are more consequential than many occupations because there is no recalling a bullet once fired. Issues in policing also persist because the occupation has tended to form a protective ring around personnel who violate policies rather than discipline them. Many police chiefs and unions stand by officers regardless of the gravity of their offenses and the reputational damage to the service. To put it politely, the record of police services and their unions in Canada and the US is generally one that impedes reforms and treats the most basic criticism as a declaration of war. They tend to create an essentialized us versus them mentality among officers. Elected leaders over time become worried about being targeted or portrayed as pro-crime. That approach creates a negative feedback loop with police chiefs in some jurisdictions disempowered from suspending or sacking officers with long, poor disciplinary records by union mobilization and agreements. Some serving officers act with impunity because they know, come what may, their union will back them. Police unions can be partners in reforms, but so far, the centripetal and centrifugal forces within them do not seem to allow that to happen. Things do not have to be that way. Entities like ASA, the Alberta Serious Incident Response Team, take too long to complete investigations and rarely bring charges against police officers. In the rare circumstances where charges are recommended, they may in fact be overruled. The case of Pacy Dumas, of course, is a prime example. Unlike other occupations, the policing field has not done a good job of instituting a strict disciplinary architecture to deal with policy violations by members. That is not the norm in many professions. For example, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta maintains on its website a regularly updated list of physicians who have been disciplined. The website shows the names of physicians, facilities, complaints, and results of adjudication proceedings against physicians. This mechanism does not guarantee zero medical malpractice or ethics violation, but minimizes the potential to offend and therefore preserves the integrity of the practice of medicine. My recommendation when I served as special advisor to the government of Alberta on Police Act Review was to have an independent, civilian-led oversight entity in which people who have served in any police or military organizations play no role. That is what our peer countries are doing. There is a need for greater transparency in policing in Edmonton and across the country. Now, whose interest does it serve to not release the identities of the victims and the officers involved in police shootings? Across several U.S. jurisdictions, for example, the names of victims are released once their next of kin are notified. There is wide variation, but police services that are relatively well regarded treats such issues as matters of public interest and a transparency test. Excessive use of force incidents are consequential for society. Derek Chauvin had ratcheted up at least 16 disciplinary cases before he killed George Floyd in May 2020. Keeping trigger-happy officers on the streets is a tragedy waiting to happen and a major disservice to police organizations. Refusal to ensure meaningful consequences in glaring cases of excessive force destroys the trust between communities and the police. We should avoid treating calls for police accountability as anti-police. Research shows that although a level of force is required for police work, excessive use of force makes policing more dangerous, even for police officers. It has the potential to influence negatively police-citizen encounters. On a per capita basis, ACERT is the second busiest organization of its kind in Canada. It deals with 25.4% of all cases of police shootings and killings of civilians in the country, fewer only than the SIU, the Special Investigations Unit in Ontario. This is a poor use of force record. A major part of the problem is the protectionist racket that is constantly woven around those who do in fact get involved in brutality to civilians. We currently treat policing in Canada as a set of manual skills that can be acquired after 6 months and 2 weeks of basic training on top of grade 12 level education. Several of our peer countries in Europe are professionalizing policing with stringent entry requirements. This typically include 3 to 4 year degrees in police colleges or civilian universities, plus a high disciplinary bar to remain in service. It is perhaps worthwhile to remind ourselves that in jurisdictions like England and Wales, the police do not in fact routinely carry weapons, or firearms I mean. Only specialized units do. That may not be feasible for us right now given the firepower in civilian hands, but it is something to definitely think about. There is a need to professionalize policing and minimize reliance on force. The first step is ending the practice of paid administrative leave for officers facing major, egregious disciplinary problems. I've also called for 50% female representation in police services where a significant number of female officers tend to have lower levels of reliance on force and lower degrees of cases of excessive use of force. I've also proposed a 3 strikes rule in the case of abuse of civilians so that by the 3rd count, an officer who has a record of abusing civilians gets shown the door. The exception would be a case where a civilian is killed in the hands of such an officer. An officer who has murdered a citizen who was unarmed, I don't think has any further business with being in the police. Enhanced training is important. Giving officers training that lasts 6 months and 2 weeks is insufficient. It is outdated. Many of our peer countries are moving away from that to far more robust training regimen involving 2 or more years. There's also a need for whistleblower protection to encourage officers to come out to talk about issues of abuse that they might have witnessed while working. Finally, there's a need for more diverse police services up to and including the top hierarchy. Thank you.
Nearly 10 months after 33-year-old Steven Newan died, his family says they are at a loss for words. On June 5th, Newan was fatally shot. Police responded after hearing about a man armed with a knife attached to a screwdriver. The statement of defense says at one point Newan drew a black rectangular object from his pocket, which had a silver or lighter color circle on the front. And that is when Constable Dudek raised his service pistol and fired 6 shots at Newan.
So my name is Samantha LeBon, and together with Mr. Tom Engel, we are counsel for the Newan family. We represent the Newan family in their pursuit of justice after the death of Steven Newan. Our aim is to shed light on this tragedy, promote the important objectives of accountability and transparency in our police service, and work towards eliminating violent and deadly use of force by police in our communities. On June 5, 2021, Constable Alex Doddock killed Steven Newan right in this very spot. His family lost a son, a brother, a friend, and a father. After his death, his family was desperate for answers, and none were given. Police refused to give any information. ACERT began to investigate, but they also did not release any information. The family did not even know the name of the person who killed their son. The only reports released were that an officer had shot and killed him, and that allegedly a weapon was involved. No photos or evidence of that alleged weapon were forthcoming, and the family continued to suffer the loss of Steven while also struggling without any information that could give them closure. We contrast this to what happens when a police officer has force used against them or anything inflicted against them. Perpetrators are immediately charged. They're immediately identified. If there's a weapon involved, the photo is immediately released to the public, released to the media, and the police separately publish it in the hopes and in the objective to show that policing is a very dangerous job and to justify their actions. The same is never distributed when the danger is the police. The family only began to learn what happened that night with Steven after they filed their civil suit against the police, which required the police respond via statement of defense. In February 2022, 8 months after Steven died, the family learned that Steven did not have a weapon that night. They learned that the reason he died was because he was alleged to be brandishing a cell phone, an iPhone. There was no weapon. The devastation and grief the family experienced only worsened. We also learned the other officer who attended with Constable Doddock never unholstered his weapon. The ACERT investigation continues to churn more than 2 years later. In the course of representing Steven's family, we've learned Constable Doddock's misconduct is not limited to the death of Steven. On August 31, 2023, Constable Doddock was criminally charged with assault causing bodily harm and assault with a weapon for an incident where he used a baton on a man, which required him to be hospitalized back in 2019, 2 years prior to killing Steven. But it doesn't stop there. In 2020, Constable Doddock was one of 2 officers who posed for a photo while taking a man into custody. And this photo was shared on their social media. The image showed the officers smugly smiling on both sides of a shirtless man who was quite clearly in distress and vulnerable and in handcuffs. The caption, with its flippant tone and hashtags like "Don't do drugs, kids," was shocking to the public. Worse, the social media post appeared to be condoned by the police until it was brought to the attention of the media and the scrutiny of the public eye. Despite this history, ranging from mean-spirited treatment of vulnerable people to violent conduct to deadly acts, while the investigation into Steven's death is ongoing, Constable Doddock was promoted to acting detective. He was given an award for investigations excellence. Shocking doesn't capture it. The fact that an officer would be promoted following a deadly use of force, while there is not 1 but 2 active ACERT investigations, is deplorable. It is difficult to see how a community could trust or have any confidence in their police service when scenarios like that are allowed to occur, with seemingly no oversight or repercussions, when the same would never be tolerated for a civilian. Why should it be tolerated for the police? This case reflects not only a quest for justice, but a fundamental reminder of the importance of police accountability, transparency, and upholding the principles of justice that are the bedrock of our society. We will fight to see this through and get accountability for Steven and his family, and to inspire change for his in our community. You can see here that these are bullet holes from when Steven was shot that have been covered, and you can see the indents in the structure. And what the family has done, and the family can correct me if I'm wrong, but a symbol of pain and hurt, the family has transformed into a place of remembrance and joy for him, right? We have messages from him, we have flowers. They told me about how a community member made this for them to commemorate Steven. And this was a community member who actually heard the gunshots. And this is a way to sort of pay tribute, pay respect, and to honor Steven and his family. And so it's an ever reminding symbol to the community, both the Newan family and the community at large, that justice for Steven Newan. So this is the statement of the family. Our family has been dealing with unimaginable pain since losing Steven. We have been completely devastated and traumatized. Steven did not have a weapon. We cannot understand how this could happen at the hands of police, the ones who are supposed to serve and protect us. It's been more than 2 years and we still do not have answers. The chief has never reached out to our family and just has stayed silent throughout it all. The EPS needs to be held accountable. Why does it take years for ACERT to do their investigations? It's impossible to have closure and heal when this is ongoing. We need change. We do not want another family to go through this tragedy. Steven was very loved and he is missed. He deserves justice. We need justice for Steven Newan. Thank you, everyone.
Detective Dan Beheels. This is a detective that led an investigation into the person many people know as Abdullah Shah. Beheels' investigation didn't just stop with Shah. He started investigating members of the EPS as well and making very serious allegations. In his January 2021 report to Chief McPhee, Beheels wrote, "I believe that members of the Edmonton Police Service have engaged in corrupt acts that have effectively insulated this criminal organization from investigation and prosecution." And this investigation lasted 2-3 years, ultimately led to no charges. Feeling as if he had exhausted every option, Beheels turned whistleblower.
I've been a police officer that was investigated for wrongdoing, and I've been a police officer trying to report wrongdoing by others. I've been a whistleblower working outside of a system that offers no protections to someone who wants to do the right thing. You see, municipal police officers in Alberta are specifically excluded from whistleblower protection laws, and globally, Canada is an embarrassment in that regard. In a 2021 study by the Government Accountability Project, Canada's whistleblower protection laws were ranked less effective and less comprehensive than almost every other country. Laws that offer protections to police whistleblowers in Alberta, or just the city of Edmonton, are important, but a long way from being a reality. We would get better witnesses. More police officers would be free to do the right thing. More opportunities for that unifying justice. More broadly, and without having to wait for a new law to be passed, each and every one of us needs to take responsibility for this problem. Drop the cynical attitude that it won't work or that the system is too broken. Be the good witness. Enter public service. Push the bureaucracy to work as intended. File those appeals. We have to have patience, courage, and above all, stamina.
If you could wave a wand, what rules, what laws would be changed tomorrow?
Well, I think that I believe very heartily in the idea of subsidiarity. I think that whether it's at the municipal level, which we do have control over, we can enact public interest disclosure laws that would protect whistleblowers, whether it's police or other city employees that are currently exempted in the provincial legislation, or add one line to the provincial legislation. It'd be very simple to include municipal employees because they're excluded today. Federally, again, if we were able to push for federal legislation that covers all government employees that want to bring forward wrongdoing and be good witnesses, but offer them protections so that reprisals don't occur for those whistleblowers, I know they would make a big difference.
Do you have any thoughts on how the internal mechanism of policing can change or should change?
I think it comes down to the principles. I mean, we've lost track of that. And I know I'm not just trying to say generally as police officers. I mean, as a society, I think everyone can look around and realize that it's not working as intended. And we all have a responsibility to that. And that sometimes we do give into that cynicism, like I was just saying, is that we think, yeah, it's not going to work. What's the point? they're so big and I'm so small. But if you don't try it, if you don't make them do what's wrong because you expect them to, because you are just going to give up on their behalf, then it will never get fixed. You can't surrender before trying, and that's the way we have all been behaving.
I don't know if you can comment on when you are the person without the power trying to take a person with power, make a person with power accountable, how that worked for you and how that necessarily works in society.
I think the first response is denial, right? Everyone you talk to, it's like, well, no, it couldn't possibly be true. You must be seeing it wrong. And that's the way it happens for everyone, because that bias is brought into it. That's why we have to rely on the system so much, because if the system operating as intended is indeed blind, then yeah, we'll see justice. That's great. But as soon as we have individuals that give into that bias, thinking, again, someone who's in a position of power, who is like in a police organization, guy's wearing a white shirt, he must have been through a lot, he must have seen everything, and he's of course reliable. We all rely on him. As someone in a position of power who's in the upper ranks, the bias is understandably towards making sure that, no, we have to see all facets of this first. And sometimes that leads us to make excuses where they ought not to be made.
Police accountability journalism is not only important to do, but it's also really hard to do. And one of the reasons why it's so hard to do is because the police actively frustrate it, and because the police accountability systems here and everywhere are broken. And as someone who covers police, tries to hold police accountable through journalism, I get a front row seat to just how poorly these systems function. And I'm happy to walk through a couple of examples. One thing that's been mentioned already, police discipline. Police do something, a complaint is made, investigation happens. Eventually there's a police discipline hearing, usually years down the road, but eventually there is. The names of the police officers or police officer are not released. All you get is a notice that a police discipline hearing is happening. So imagine you're an editor or a journalist. You get the notification that something's happening. You have no idea who it is. You have no details of the case. You have to make a decision there to allocate scarce resources, your time or your reporter's time, to go, I'm going to go to a hearing, I'm going to burn a half a day. And is it a cop who shouldn't have written a jaywalking ticket, or is it a cop who, murdered someone? You don't know literally until you get there. The EPS make their own judgment call about whether or not to release the name of the police officer who has been disciplined. There's some filter they apply. What it is, they've never told anyone. They've certainly never told me. And the police disciplinary hearing process is just irretrievably broken as a process of public oversight. Say you go to a police disciplinary hearing. Are you able to get an agreed statement of facts? No. Are you able to get the spelling of the name of the presiding officer? I've been denied that. Is there a video feed? Is there a recording of the matter? No, there is not. It is hard to really put into words how just unused to pushback the institution of policing is. I run a small 3-person independent media shop. The Edmonton Police have 20 full-time communications staff. It is not comparable really in any way.
Don't underestimate the power of the media, though. What I think is that if you can bring to the attention of the media issues about police reform, police misconduct, that's the best thing you can do. Get it out there in the public. You've got to get the public on your side. And the way to do that is through the eyes and the ears of the public, the media. They will listen to you. You establish a rapport with them, they will listen to you. I try to get my clients to talk to the media, to come forward publicly. and get that story out. It's very powerful. The only way to change policing is to make politicians think, if I don't do this, I'm going to lose votes.
Hi everyone, my name is Kenzie Gordon. I'm a board member of an organization in Edmonton called Sexual Assault Voices of Edmonton that was actually founded 10 years ago in partnership with the Edmonton Police Service. Policing is not a solution to gender-based violence in our community and is in fact often making it worse. So that kind of led us to the creation of a project called the Edmonton Police Violence Archive. So what we're trying to do with the archive is create a centralized source of information about what does police violence look like in our community. The police have a stranglehold on that information. It's very difficult to find out even something as simple as the result of a disciplinary hearing for an officer, right? You have to FOIP that information and the police control release of that information. So our goal was to try and make it possible for people in our community to even understand what is happening with policing in this community. How can we advocate for a better system? How can we advocate against certain forms of violence if we don't even know what they are? I think the information piece is something that we've really seen lacking. Edmonton has a world-renowned open data portal. You know, cities all over the world are envious of how easy it is to access information in our city. You can find the location of every fruit tree in our entire city, but you can't find information on what officers have been charged with a crime against the citizens of our community, and that's a problem. We work in partnership with the Alberta Police Misconduct Database, which has been run by a team of lawyers and legal professionals who have consolidated all of the cases that have gone to some sort of prosecution or charges against police officers in Alberta. So we work closely with them to kind of try and bring those pieces of information together and start to make a bit of a map.
Data and ongoing research have brought to light the intergenerational trauma that runs through Indigenous communities, including my own. It's disheartening to see more Indigenous people being negatively impacted by police approaches. I'm a mother, and I fear what the future holds for my First Nations child when the statistics are so bleak. Throughout my journey, I've also had the privilege of working alongside individuals who have had the right values, the right mindsets for the work that policing entails, who have also been deferred from policing. And it's brought into perspective to me that many officers who get through to the other side of policing often are ones with mindsets that shouldn't be there. It's often made me question why the ones who should be there aren't there and were deferred. Policing throughout my life was often glamorized with the promises of job security and benefits, but it was always disheartening to witness people being mistreated and harassed by officers. Throughout my work in security, I've worked alongside peace officers in healthcare settings and thinking I could help make a difference. I've realized quickly that harm reduction doesn't necessarily exist in policing or in law enforcement or even in security. And to me, the value of property wasn't as much as the value of life. Unfortunately, the core issues of police and enforcement mentality lack a lot of cultural competency, and systemic racism persists. I don't believe it's just a matter of a few bad apples. I think that we know some officers engage in racism and that the system often turns a blind eye. There's a huge lack of accountability for discriminatory and even violent conduct, especially when it targets Indigenous people. I've seen this systemic racism firsthand, both during my professional work experience and in my educational experience with correctional services, learning about the justice system. I think it's essential that we acknowledge that the root causes of social issues aren't substance use, but colonial violence and systemic racism. Harm reduction taught me that substance use isn't the cause of crime or violence. It's a correlation rather than a causation.